Initially, we will summarize the primary characteristics that define the LDC community. We will then discuss fundamental issues surrounding several nations of minimal development and conclude with a brief summary of each country's adaptive strategies and their proposed solutions to climate change. Climate change is regarded as the most substantial environmental issue of the 21st century and potentially of all recorded history. It is undeniable that industrialized nations are culpable for this global threat. Regardless, rising sea level, deforestation, and increased natural disaster risk will impact all Earth's inhabitants. Therefore, those that are incapable of adapting to and protecting themselves from rapid climatic change must be prioritized. This group, known as the least developed countries, or LDCs, constitute a significant portion of the world's population. The LDCs are the group of countries deemed the poorest and most vulnerable in the world by the United Nations. To be deemed an LDC, the country's gross national income must not meet the minimum of 1,404 Australian dollars. Countries of minimal development have weak human resources, where nutrition, health, education, and adult literacy are all lacking in comparison to first world countries. Moreover, LDCs tend to be viewed as economically vulnerable. This means that the agricultural sector is unstable, as is their export and import industry. As of 2017, there are 51 countries classified as LDCs, roughly a quarter of all countries in the world. Of these 51 countries, 34 are African, 10 are Asian, 5 are Pacific, and 1 Caribbean. Another way of interpreting this is that 62% of African countries, 20% of Asian countries, 35% of Oceanic countries, and 10% of Caribbean countries are LDCs. Climate change significantly affects the Earth and everything that inhabits it. The consequences of climate change have only been identified within the last few decades. However, human-induced climate change has been in effect for thousands of years. The mass burning of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution has released over 600 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Deforestation and large-scale farming beginning 8,000 years ago are major culprits. The greenhouse effect has altered Earth's natural systems so much that many scientists believe we have entered a new geological epoch known as the Anthropocene or Age of Humans. Global temperatures increase, sea levels rising, sporadic weather events, droughts, floods, ocean acidification, ozone damage, and the disruption of interglacial cycles are examples of the devastating impact of climate change. Earth is set to warm between 1.4 to 4.8 degrees Celsius by 2100, with the 2-degree warming being classed as dangerous by climate scientists. 98% of scientists around the world agree that climate change is happening, and without global efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, disastrous consequences lay ahead for future generations and the health of our planet. For the sake of this assignment, we've chosen 3 key LDC countries: Ethiopia, Haiti, and Nepal. These countries are figureheads for the LDC community.
Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries in the world. Around 85% of Ethiopia's population depends on agriculture for sustainable life. Hence, Ethiopia is severely impacted by rapid climate change. Ethiopia is located on the east side of Africa and shares borders with 5 countries: Kenya, Sudan, Djibouti, Somalia, and Eritrea, with a population of 93,815,992. On behalf of the LDCs, Jibru Jimba Endalu stated that climate change is costing lives and livelihoods, particularly in poor and vulnerable countries, so there is a need for urgent action by all countries. The LDC group will continue to push for fair and ambitious action by all. Thus, Ethiopia as a LDC supports countries that seek to prevent climate change and who are part of the solution, not the problem. The countries that Mr. Endalu was speaking on behalf of are 48 countries, including many African, Middle Eastern, Asian, and Pacific nations. Since climate change is global, concerns about its impact on agriculture in developing countries have been increasing. Climate change is particularly damaging to the countries in Africa, such as Ethiopia, who are dependent on rain. Today, 85% of Ethiopia's population is still engaged in subsistence agriculture, and the other 15% live in what is classified as dry land area. It is expected that changes in climate will lead to regular droughts and heavy rainfall in different parts of Ethiopia, reducing the quantity of arable land and decreasing crop productivity. For example, there was a flood in 2006 located in western Ethiopia that destroyed 1,650 hectares of maize and reduced agriculture benefits by 20%. Food shortages and cases of malnutrition arose in the region. A case study was done on how farmers adapt to unpredictable climate, suggesting that rapid change in climate affects crop revenue per hectare. Slight increases in temperature during summer and winter significantly reduces crop net revenue per hectare. Similarly, slight increases in precipitation during spring significantly increase net crop revenue. It is predicted that throughout the next 100 years, the crop net revenue will keep reducing due to these varied climatic factors. Climate change also impacts on the general health of the Ethiopian citizens through transmission of disease. Malaria transmission has been associated with varied maximum temperature. Specifically, in the highland sector of central Ethiopia, a correlation has been identified between increased malaria prevalence and warming trends from 1968 to 1993. Dengue fever is also recognised as a disease that worsens during periods of rapid climate change. Dengue fever is the world's most prevalent mosquito-borne virus and is predominantly carried by Aedes aegypti mosquito. This mosquito is strongly affected by the density of water and climate, including variability in temperature and moisture. As air density varies in irregular climate, this mosquito thrives without appropriate precautions. Climate change also impacts the community through lack of water resources, sanitation and hygiene. This predominantly affects the communities who live in rural areas. Water shortages can force the communities to rely on unsafe sources, increasing exposure to waterborne disease. Regular self-cleansing in this water affects personal hygiene. Children often walk large distances to retrieve water to sustain their family. These journeys disrupt their school programs, adversely impacting their education.
Industrialised countries are the world's biggest polluters, inadvertently provoking climate change. Since Ethiopia is a developing country, it is not industrialised. Therefore, it is reasonable to think that Ethiopia does not contribute to climate change. This may vary as Ethiopia aims to industrialise. Ethiopia is one of the world's largest coffee bean suppliers. As natural disasters destroy bean plantations, the world loses supply to a very important industry.
Developing countries are most vulnerable to climate change. However, they lack the financial, technical, and administrative resources required to combat negative impacts. Ethiopia has prepared well by establishing national goals such as dedicating a $7.5 billion budget towards climate change adaptation and reaching zero net carbon emissions by 2025. Moreover, Ethiopia works to develop strategies for adaptation to agricultural vulnerabilities. As a significantly poor nation, Ethiopia is exposed to the worst impacts of climate change. Therefore, Ethiopia may deliberately overlook climate change mitigation and instead focus on addressing present concerns through adaptation. Primarily, Ethiopia has focused on developing a more resilient agricultural industry as a fundamental component of Ethiopia's economic growth. Variability in climate alterations threatens the livelihood and sustainability of this relationship. Current strategies focus on adjustment to crop and livestock production, natural resource management and diversification to create new food and income resources. Ethiopia's National Adaptation Programme of Action develops adaptation policies for issues with the highest potential for positive impact. International stakeholders also assist in the development of Ethiopia's climate change adaptation strategies through organisations. For example, the CIMMYT works to support Ethiopia's agricultural and food security and develops crop management practices for long-term sustainability. The effectiveness of policymakers and government action to implement highly beneficial climate change adaptation tactics in Ethiopia is challenged by the complexity of decision-making as it is influenced by a variety of important components. Sensitivity analysis is important to fully understanding the value of even small changes that accelerate negative climate change impact. The adaptive capacity considers the multiple scales of adaptation. Furthermore, it focuses on short-term adaptation to climate change without considering possible maladaptations experienced in the long term. Economic analysis is also important in Ethiopia to address poverty, as well as climate change risks. With so many components to consider, even the most thorough strategies are confronted by adversity. Ethiopia is also limited by the lack of finance and technology. For example, they can only afford $440 million per year on the effects of climate change, which is well under their set budget. Currently, there isn't enough information available to be able to effectively analyse the vulnerabilities and determine sustainable adaptation practices. As the agricultural sector is more at risk and presents the highest potential for implementing successful adaptation strategies, it places great importance on the smallholder farms to adapt. Future solutions for farming in Ethiopia require greater land access, funding and information. More accurate information can be found if researchers begin to acknowledge long-term changes rather than relying on recent climate trends when developing agricultural practice. Furthermore, research and understanding of different ecosystems and natural resource management will produce more effective solutions. This includes expanding crop cultivation and pastoral areas for farming opportunities and using rangelands as carbon sinks, which would be equally as beneficial as reducing poverty by diversification of local resources. The main factors preventing Ethiopia combating climate change effectively are economic and political in nature. Ethiopia lacks the resources necessary to fight against climate change as effectively as a first world country. Every LDC has a GNI per capita of less than $1,406. Therefore, Ethiopia is economically vulnerable regarding the import and export of goods and possesses the low quality of life on the planet when considering health, education, and literacy. The main factor restricting Ethiopia's response is the financial demands they are unable to meet due to their weak economies and poverty-stricken communities. To implement an effective plan that promotes transition to a low-emission society, costs are in excess of 100 trillion USD. The primary factors restricting Ethiopia's response to climate change are both economic and political.
Haiti is located in the Caribbean and is the 149th largest nation in the world. Despite this, it is considered to be one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change as a result of the significant environmental degradation caused by the overexploitation of forest resources, soils, water, quarries, and coastal waters. Poor socio-economic conditions can lead to extreme climate change vulnerability. While being prone to the world's most harsh environmental stresses, Haiti has experienced a declining GDP since 1982 and serious political turmoil in the past few decades. In turn, this leads to increased climate change exposure as Haiti does not have the capacity to manage these substantial concerns. The degradation of the country's resources reduces its ability to survive extreme weather events as well as environmental changes such as reduced water resources, increased soil erosion, coastal erosion, and ecosystem degradation. Other factors such as high population densities, fragile ecosystems, and limited institutional capacity result in the serious challenges in developing a changing climate. The following video demonstrates the direct impact of climate change on families and citizens.
In Haiti, storms force a woman to flee her shanty home. Burkina Faso in West Africa, a flash flood destroys a village.
On a vu effectivement, nous avons perdu effectivement tous nos biens,
the women's cooking
les ustensiles
utensils,
de cuisine des
our
femmes,
houses. Apart from a few, all the houses
nos
were
habillements,
lost.
toutes les maisons sont parties.
chimanga chidapita mbali
I lost
imodzi
3/4 of my maize crop.
mpunga sitinapeze
Also the
bwinayi
beans, rice,
tidachuluka
sweet
madziso
potatoes,
nyemba
all swept away.
sitinakolola mokwanira chifukwa chochuluka kwa madzi.
It's banal to say it. The most vulnerable are the most exposed. The poorest countries, the least responsible for global warming, the most susceptible to the natural disasters it causes. Burkina Faso, 90% of the population live off farming. Like its West African neighbours in the Sahel, here there are repeated droughts, failed harvests. And this, the result. 300,000 children under 5 acutely malnourished. And as one drought succeeds another, the situation worsens. Disrupted crop cycles can lead to hunger and malnutrition. Countries like Burkina experience critical temperatures, affecting the people's welfare, the productivity of their crops.
Haiti lies in a hurricane corridor and is plummeted every rainy season by tropical storms that destroy crops and infrastructure. In 2008, in the space of 30 days, 4 hurricanes occurred where over 60% of agricultural crops were destroyed and over 1,000 people killed. These hurricanes have resulted in a higher mortality rate and greater infrastructure damage than any other environmental disaster or climate change-related source of degradation. As a result of climate change, the occurrence and severity of hurricanes is increased. Damage due to flooding has increased as deforestation and heavy downpours have removed topsoil. As a result of climate change, precipitation patterns become irregular, contributing to increased drought and excessive precipitation and attendant flooding. As a result of these extreme weather events, the food supply in Haiti is severely impacted. Erosion and poor soil health lead to decreased livestock and crop productivity. Diminished food production promotes malnutrition and a greater dependence on imported goods. Specifically, the fish market, a large part of the source of nutrition for people in Haiti, is expected to decline due to the changes in ocean temperature and salinity increase. Haiti contributes to climate change through the consumption of fossil fuels comprising of coal, oil, petroleum, and natural gas production. 22.02% of energy consumption in Haiti is comprised of fossil fuels. 19.99% of the energy sources in Haiti emit methane, and 7.89% of the energy sources emit nitrous oxide. 91.29% of the electricity production is from oil, gas, and coal sources, and Haiti consumes electric power at 38.97 kilowatts per capita. Wood is the main source for energy in Haiti, accounting for 70% of the energy consumption in 2006, resulting in an estimated 6,000 hectares of soil lost each year.
Haiti's capacity to combat climate change is limited due to insufficient budget and inadequate technologies. Moreover, as a small, isolated island, Haiti is subject to significant adversity by culpable, big polluting nations such as the United States and China. Thus, minorities like Haiti must be supported and prioritized in adaptation and mitigation efforts. Data collection at a local level, local government action, refined agricultural practice, and ecosystem preservation are being pursued by Haitian governments as methods of initial adaptation to climate change. Generally, environmentally friendly business and sustainable income options are promoted by influential organizations like the United States Agency for International Development to make climate change adaptation more appealing and realistic. As these strategies are being promoted by informed figures, it would suggest that they have been effective in other parts of the world. However, determining the effectiveness of these strategies is difficult, as their influence can only be gauged over long periods. In the long term, the effectiveness of these suggested strategies depends on Haiti's capacity to alter their behavior. Imported fossil fuel is the primary energy source for developing countries as it is acquired easily and is affordable. 90% of this energy is petroleum and the remaining 10% is oil.
Renewable energy technology is relatively recent innovation. Countries of minimal economic growth cannot afford to implement this technology. Therefore, they become heavily reliant on fossil fuel consumption, increasing carbon emissions and climate change rates. Moreover, in disaster risk management, plans are deemed inaccurate at present to deal with climate change consequences. For example, inadequate data has been collected on hurricane-vulnerable low-lying coastal zones, and so when natural disaster occurs, control of the situation may be overlooked. Primarily, Haiti's response is limited to the growth of their economy and quality of policies designed to manage climatic impacts. Nepal, located in South Asia, is geographically one of the smallest countries in the world and holds a population of 26.4 million. Due to the country's high level of poverty and hunger, Nepal is seen as a country of minimal development, facing an enormous amount of challenges, including poverty, eradication, and socio-economic development. Nepal must prioritise mitigation of their ecological footprint. However, the national leaders see this as an opportunity to reduce their total emissions, increase economic growth rates simultaneously. Nepal contributes to 0.05% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. Nevertheless, the government is investing in solar technology as a method of reducing harmful emissions. Utilisation of this renewable energy source not only decreases their ecological footprint, but also serves a solution to their energy crisis. Nepal's government is one of the most proactive in increasing their reliance on renewable technology. For example, the government has subsidised solar panels installation to promote their use. Growing initiatives and policy development illustrate their proactive, positive mentality of the Nepalese government towards emission reduction. Due to a large portion of the nation living in poverty, Nepal is exposed and vulnerable to any changes in climate. However, the investment in solar energy is seen as a possible solution to this, as not only is it limiting global emissions, but is reducing the cost of electricity in the country as well, improving the economy and the overall standard of living. The consequences of climate change have had extreme effects on Nepal. Nepal's agricultural sector is subject to greatest consequence. As their economy is largely based on this sector, they will face hard economic times leading to the degradation of households and increased poverty. Water regulations have been tightened due to the steadily increasing amounts of precipitation from global warming seen in basins across the Laucke water supply project. In the future, this will become more of an issue, leading to the challenge of increased water scarcity. A decline in Himalayan birch growth has been recorded for the past few decades due to increasing temperature and moisture decrease during spring in central Nepal. The effects of climate change have and will continue to disrupt the growth of vegetation and general biodiversity.
Deforestation has been identified as a key contributor to climate change in developing countries. The clearing of land emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and decreases the prevalence of oxygen. Many households in Nepal rely on using resources from forests every day where oxygen production is a necessity. Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in Nepal aims to create forestry policies to protect forests. However, this poses many problems for regional communities, taking away their key resources and affecting their cultural practices. Due to the visible fading of its white caps, the Himalaya typifies the visible impacts of global warming. Because of this, Nepal has put in place the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience. This is a $1.2 billion program that assists national governments in integrating climate resilience into development planning across sectors and stakeholder groups. It also provides extra funding to put the plan into action and pilot innovative public and private sector solutions to pressing climate-related risks. This program helps establish a solid foundation for integrating climate change into national, sectoral, and sub-national level planning. For the Nepalese, when they have a drought, their coping strategy is temporary migration, as the unpredictability of rainfall reduces the amount of food intake and trading of livestock. Migration is a usual practice, which has become more common and lasts for around 6 months. Temporary migration is exclusively male-orientated, as women remain in the impacted area to continue agricultural cultivation. These strategies are generally effective, but recently, temporary migration has progressed longer than 6 months due to the negative impact of climate change. When flooding occurs, the most effective strategy is to create places of refuge prior to the floods, as it keeps the community safe and positively impacts livelihood. It is common for resource packs to be created for times of emergency. Nepal, like most underdeveloped countries, is constrained in its response to climate change. Many locals are not fully educated on the topic of climate change and face extreme poverty, making it more difficult for the progress of climate change mitigation and adaptation in its communities. Nepal's unstable economy, paired with corruption in governance, makes it extremely difficult for worthwhile and expensive policies and procedures to be implemented.
It's important to consider the views of all stakeholders so an unbiased insight is given. The Catholic Church and other large religious organisations have taken a post-conventional stance on the fight against climate change. Led by Pope Francis, the Catholic Church demands that UN negotiators agree to a goal of complete decarbonisation by 2050. The Church sees this plan as a way to preserve planet Earth, link climate change to social justice, and protect those living in poverty. As a result, Catholic officials from 5 continents have signed and are in agreement with this strategy. Pope Francis has pleaded that decision-makers place the common good ahead of national interests and that they protect our common home and all of its inhabitants. Francis also believes that developed nations should take the most aggressive stance on emission mitigation, as they are primary culprits. As less economically developed countries, we agree with the Catholic Church's stance on climate change, as they believe this should be solved through measures of fairness and equality. Therefore, more developed countries who have been the main emission contributors carry most of the burden. The European Union. The European Union have identified the impacts that climatic changes have on them and the rest of the world. Thus, they have rectified their Paris Summit Agreement, now aiming to lower emissions by 40% by 2030. Decision makers are aware that the EU is the third largest party in the world behind India and the United States, and therefore must act as a world leader in the fight against climate change. They believe that emissions schemes must be fair and equitable, with developed nations carrying a large portion of the burden of lowering emissions, while providing financial support to less developed nations. The EU, unlike many of the world leaders, is on track to meet their portion of the agreement. However, a 40% reduction is not consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, as emissions will still remain. The United States. The United States, when led by Barack Obama, were seen as role models and pioneers in the fight against climate change. Although at the time they were the largest emitting nation in the world, a green movement was occurring through Parliament, with hundreds of green initiatives taking force in combating global warming. With the growth in renewable energy being seen as a way to employ millions of Americans, unemployment rates decreased and growth of domestic products increased. This strategy advocated their promise to lower emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. Although the United States was still one of the two largest polluting nations in the world, they were on track to reduce emissions at a greater rate than any other country. However, since then, Donald Trump has become the 45th President of the United States and has a very different stance on climate change. One of his first commitments as president was to eliminate harmful and unnecessary policies such as the Climate Action Plan, while promising to revive America's coal industry. If Trump does get his wishes, the United States will not reach their climate mitigation pledge. The recent shift in leadership has and will have devastating impacts upon developing nations. Moreover, the US is set to offer less financial support, making it more difficult to reach our emission goal. At the Climate Change Paris Summit of 2015, Australia ratified their pledge to lower emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030, placing them in company with most other economically developed countries. Australia believes that this is an aggressive and fair strategy. However, political parties disregarded many mitigation plans, deeming them inadequate to fight climate change. Emissions from electricity production are rising rapidly, which is worsened by the federal government's continual skepticism of renewable energy. Astonishingly, federal ministers have advised states to reopen their coal-fired power stations as more beneficial alternatives. The post-2020 pledge from China suggests that it is one of the most influential leaders in the fight against increased warming. By 2030, the government has agreed to lower their carbon intensity by 60 to 65%. This will be aided in their promise to increase their forest carbon stock volume by 4.5 billion cubic meters. The forest will act as a carbon sink, where fauna absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, decreasing their ecological footprint. The pledge from China clearly illustrates their stance on mitigating the effects of climate change. India's first significant attempts to mitigate emissions came from their pledge at the Paris Summit, promising to develop more sustainable energy sources. As a result, India will gain 40% of its electricity needs from either renewable energy or lower carbon sources by 2030, leading to a slash in carbon intensity emissions of 33 to 35%. This was a significant improvement on how India viewed climate change a decade earlier, and although carbon emissions are expected to still increase by 200% by 2030 due to its growing population, any plan to lower emissions is imperative in the fight against climate change. As developing nations with far poorer economies, India and Ethiopia require support in any way to reduce emissions. Therefore, we stand by India when seeking financial support, as we are more vulnerable to the effects of changing climate. Businesses and industries, as non-government organisations, alter their operations due to changes in their general environment. As time progresses, more and more of the population are caring for the natural environment and taking greater consideration in how their actions may influence their ecological footprint. This has led to a shift in customers choosing products and businesses that are green over those that are not. As a result, in order to obtain new customers, corporations are promoting themselves as eco-friendly and environmentally beneficial. Wanting to be seen as a green organisation and actually being green are two different things, however, with some businesses opting for the former. This recent advancement has altered how businesses view the environment. However, in many instances, these developments are designed to increase profit.
As pre-industrialized societies, LDCs are most vulnerable to variation in climate. However, their efforts to cope are primarily based on adaptation as immediate impacts must be addressed and mitigation unaffordable. Adaptation strategies advocate the prosperity of agricultural industry as the LDC's primary income source. Crop production management, natural resource management, and diversification enhancement are current methods. The role of local government has increased in importance as a solution, where government officials are obliged to educate minorities on disaster risk management. Migration to regions where climate is more predictable has been an important adaptive strategy for those living in significantly varied climates. Although adaptive strategies are in place for LDCs to manage the short-term consequences of rapid climatic change, developed nations are obliged to account for the long-term impacts as they are predominantly culpable.